Well, it's a question, isn't it? Can the church and the minister afford each other? Over the past several years, with the support of the Lilly Endowment, and we are grateful for them, select theological schools have been studying the issue of educational debt, and we are discovering a grave miscalculation. What it costs to prepare for effective ministry may never be fully discharged if one stays in ministry. That's the calculus we're talking about, unless there are some radical changes. And so I commend you for having this conversation. It's a conversation that we have all the while at Central as we try to think about educational debt, ministry compensation, the configuration of bi-professional pastoral leadership. Let's revisit the old calculus of preparation for ministry. As you know, denominations and endowment fitted most of the bill. When I went to Southern Seminary in Louisville shortly after the earth cooled, I paid approximately $300 per semester. It was called a matriculation fee, and the books and the lodging were additional, but Southern Baptists gave generously to support theological education, and I was the beneficiary. Students tended to complete their Master of Divinity in 3 years, even though it was a 90-hour degree with those languages included. I managed to hold down a couple of part-time jobs and finish in 3 years. Why? Because the denomination was funding my education. I had a little family support, but not much, but was able to make it. Most of the students were men, and the wives were the engine, the support for them being able to go to school. Most of the men were married, and there were wives who were teachers or other professions helping supplement what their preacher husband could manage on the weekends in a small student church. Their time was primarily devoted to their studies, or so they told their wives. Wives were pretty insistent that not too much goofing off occur during library hours when the students were to be studying. Well, the calculus was graduates left with very little educational debt. I finished a Master of Divinity, no debt, and was free to take a job that paid only $14,000 a year. Well, this is 1975, and I could live comfortably on that with no educational debt to discharge. And it was the same later in doctoral study because of generous denominational support. It's a different story today. And so let's assess the cost. And I'm going to talk kind of broadly beyond the Nazarene Church about what it costs to afford a theological education. Dan Aylshire of the Association of Theological Schools notes that the cost for 1 year of theological education often exceeds $30,000, which makes a Master of Divinity degree about a $100K degree. Now, the student rarely carries the whole of that, endowment, and all the rest. Students on average pay between 1/3 and 1/2 of the cost. And that's still a considerable amount, but the schools and the denominations have to find ways to make up the rest. In our school's study of educational debt, the level of financial obligations some students bring with them to seminary has astonished us. Regrettably, some have never gained essential financial planning knowledge, and others have simply believed that if they followed God's call to ministry, God will take care of the finances. Now, I believe in great faith, but sometimes there's a fine line between faith and foolishness, especially when we try to spiritualize all financial realities. A level of naivete shapes some entering congregational leadership, as you were talking about, Dale. And the economics of ministry simply elude some folk. Theological students are not alone in racking up educational debt. It's a national crisis in higher education. This past week, I heard a distinguished former president speak about the state of theological education, and he described our seminaries as the canary in the whole mine of higher education. We are feeling some of the financial stresses earlier than others. There's a national crisis in terms of educational debt. And this kind of debt outstrips now what people owe on their credit cards. That was summer before last when that actually surpassed what the credit is. The difference is that there's a clear bankruptcy option for credit card debt. Student loan debt is with you always, even unto the end of the age. Unless you can prove extreme hardship, which is not easily done under either Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy laws. Now, while seminaries do their very best to limit tuition by providing generous scholarships, the fixed costs of running a seminary, especially a freestanding one, not embedded in a university, the costs are significant. Libraries, personnel, accreditation costs, benefits, and facilities conspire to make the cost of educating students steep. And for those buildings, for those seminaries with venerable buildings, I don't know if you all would qualify for venerable buildings, deferred maintenance becomes an insuperable burden, which hikes costs even higher. A friend of mine at a seminary in another state has said, we don't call it deferred maintenance. We don't ever intend to do it. So it's not deferred. Central faced a $16 million figure in deferred maintenance when we decided to make our move. We thought, we have a shot at an ongoing mission, or we can stay here and it will consume all of the resources that we have. These are decisions some churches make as well, and our board has had to be pretty radical in its decision making in trying to answer this question about how can the seminary sustain its mission so that the student and the church can afford one another. There's another issue in our time, the cultural shifts which are pushing churches to the margin. Why spend 3 or 4 years acquiring an MDiv if there is no guarantee of full-time, lifetime employment? Churches in smaller communities are struggling as populations shift to cities. Older churches in cities are rattling around in excess capacity buildings, grimly calculating how long the endowment will last. What's the burn rate? Will it be here to bury my mother, etc.? Of course, I believe churches will continue if they are nimble, if they are service-oriented, if they are missional. As they learn to be outwardly focused for the sake of their communities, they will flourish in gospel witness. But they may not be able to afford all the same amenities or the same staffing. Now, compounding this shift to the margin of congregations is the reality that so many who enter leadership in ministry are dragging the freight of educational debt. And often it is debt from prior schooling. We have been having a pilot cohort. My colleague Angie Barker Jackson here, herself a bi-professional person, pastor and program director at Central, has been working with a pilot cohort of students. And we have frankly been astonished by how much students bring before they ever take their first class in seminary. And it's not necessarily that they might accrue that much more while in seminary, although many do max out what they can borrow from the federal loan program because the seminary cannot prevent that. That is their right, as you know. But we are rather astonished by what students bring with them. Seminaries require a 4-year bachelor degree as a prerequisite to admission. And often this BA is completed at a median annual tuition of $24K to $31K per year. And the result of this is that a typical seminarian will arrive at the seminary doorstep with significant student loan debt as they come in the door. In 2005, 2006, I'm going to pick on the Episcopals here for just a moment, not the Nazarenes and not the Baptists. They commissioned a study of the 2006 class of the 11 Episcopal seminaries, and the study revealed that 2/3 of the students were leaving with significant debt. The average debt load of each student was right at $40,000, halfway in the theological program, halfway in the MDiv. They owed approximately $40,000. Meanwhile, the annual median compensation package, including housing allowance for new clergy, was a mere $44,500. I always thought the Episcopals were God's chosen, but they start here as well. Yet bank lenders will tell us you need $60,000 of income to pay for the living expenses and effectively manage educational debt of $38,000. Well, that's an interesting calculus there. And one of the things that we are seeking to discern at Central is there a tipping point? How many years out with X amount of debt before a person departs from pastoral ministry? And you realize what a seminary has invested, what a student has invested, and really the tragedy of the educational debt making the decision as to whether or not one remains in ministry. There's another issue at hand as we think about pastoral formation. Students learn what it means to be in debt. They learn to accept debt as a real reality in their life and in their ministry. And this is perhaps sad enough when referring to secular institutions, but even more so when it applies to seminarians engaged in pastoral formation. Regrettably, many students will max out the federal loan program to fund more than tuition costs. Indeed, they are borrowing to fund a certain lifestyle and ignore the financial realities. It's a different time in which we live, and the sense that a person can pursue ministry or the preparation for ministry without financial sacrifice seems rather old school to many in our time. But the problem of this debt is that it limits vocational options. It makes it harder for churches to call folk. It makes it harder for these emerging leaders to pursue what they believed God called them to do. Seminary debt is keeping young, innovative clergy from being able to take risks in their ministry, such as planting a church. That's risk, isn't it? The same risks, in fact, that a 21st century church needs to be making. We need persons who are entrepreneurial and innovative to do the kind of church plants and new ministries. It is so much harder for them when finances are the weight that tugs at them. This reality discourages creative leaders who once deeply desired to be transformative in troubled neighborhoods, often those most in need of stable congregations, and young leadership can't do it because of the financial realities. Students often spend their seminary days focused on money rather than becoming theologically educated. Another challenge. What the church most needs: reliable guides, good interpreters of Scripture, good preachers, good, thoughtful, energetic leaders, and the distractions of trying to pay for school, working the extra jobs, and kind of skittering through the theological curriculum. Older students, and we have some, you may have some now, older students worry about depleting their savings or their retirement accounts in order to pursue a pastoral calling. And they also have the challenges of their families. The truth is that for almost all students, debt is a reality. Well, what about the compensation they might expect in the marketplace? Well, many have unrealistic financial expectations, both the church and the graduate. I think I've got an image of being paid in chickens. Yes, I know that there was that reality along the way for the rural pastor. I have been one in Kentucky. Thank goodness they cooked the chickens. Now, the old thinking is that the noble profession of ministry is above earthly concerns. And the members of the personnel committee will often surmise it will work its way out. And they fail to do the math on what commensurate schooling commands in the marketplace. The consequences of this are harmful to churches, communities, and their ministers. Congregations seemingly cannot afford to pay pastors and teachers of the church at compensation levels that will be necessary to service the increasing debt of those who have received a postgraduate theological education. This means that only large churches will be able to continue to afford to call adequate numbers of pastoral and teaching staffs, which average size and especially small rural or inner city churches will in an increasing way go without. It's the big steeples that will be able to do the compensation. I don't know about your tradition, but I imagine there is some decline in terms of stewardship kind of across the board in how ministry and mission are funded. In a recent Christian Century blog, David Lewicki calls churches and judicatories to equalize pastor salaries. Isn't that a novel idea? He articulates the stark realities faced by underpaid ministers. How do you pay school loans, afford a mortgage, make car payments, save for college or retirement, and occasionally have a night out? What if a health crisis ensues on top of all of that? And the stress of pastors and other ministers in our congregation is a major concern. So do we rethink theological education? Yes. Do we rethink how pastors are going to configure their time? It looks like a necessity. Many schools are shifting delivery methods so that theological education is more accessible and more affordable. Not only has scheduling shifted, in our place, no more coming 3 days a week at 8 a.m. to learn Greek. I never knew why it was always at 8 a.m. For Greek. Somehow it's kind of the shock and awe of going to seminary to have to study languages before you've had enough coffee. Many schools are shifting when they will offer classes. Evenings, weekends, intensive formats that will work with ministry and other professional positions. Most of us old professors have endured this change rather kicking and screaming, yet it is a way forward in managing this reality. We've moved to a trimester system, which allows fewer classes in a shorter term, which can alleviate some of the stressors of achieving a work-life balance. And particularly for working pastors, having those breaks at the heaviest liturgical seasons, Advent, Lent, Easter, has been helpful. And technologically enhanced education makes it possible for learners to have synchronous and asynchronous class experiences, proving to be quite effective. Some in real time, some working on their own time. Well, I won't trumpet other changes that our school has made, but it's been in the interest of the sustainability of the school as well as the affordability and accessibility for working ministers. And there are new models of ministry emerging as well. I think I've got a picture of a pastor wearing a clerical robe and a business suit. Maybe not. No, we've changed the pictures. Okay. Many persons will pursue their vocation in ministry while at the same time pursuing other forms of livelihood, which may be considered ministry. I really appreciated what you said. The bi-professional, the bivocational, it's not a truncation. It may well be an expansion of ministry, and it may well be the primary pathway of the future. Churches need to get over the notion that having a bivocational minister is something to be ashamed of. I've so often heard people say, I'm only bivocational. That's not the way to say it. We should celebrate that person who has additional giftedness that can be used in other ways. And for churches, it should be viewed as cutting edge and a means of extending the reach of the church into the larger social landscape. These new models of ministry can empower laity with more church ownership. The notion that their pastor is in the workaday world as well is often a very healthful wake-up for their parishioners. I know that when, after a long day, I head to an evening stewardship committee meeting at my church, I remember when I was on a church staff, and I wondered why those laypersons were so tired and drug into those meetings late. Well, the bi-professional minister has a different view. The final point that I want to suggest is that we must forge better seminary and congregational partnerships in the way that we educate and in the way that we fund education. We, as a part of our grant, we set up some internships in churches where the church would match what the Lilly Grant did, and they would have an intern for 10 hours a week for 2 semesters, etc., a match at the level of $10,000. What we discovered is how strapped many churches are, that they couldn't squeeze that out in order to have a part-time youth person or community minister of some nature. It's been difficult to find churches who will do these kinds of matches. What I wanted the churches to learn is it costs to educate their pastors. One day we had an Economics of Ministry Summit at Central, and one pastor just raised his hand and said, "Why do you charge tuition at all?" And I thought, well, we pay a faculty and we keep the lights on, and it was rather stunning to me because I thought, we need to connect the dots here. It costs to educate, and many churches are not aware of what their pastors are bringing with them. And so to negotiate fair compensation for internships and acknowledge the reality of educational debt when a new minister is called is a critical thing. Many congregations do not know educational costs, loan programs, or how significant the preparation of a Master of Divinity is for effective ministry. 3 to 4 year professional degree equivalent to a Doctor of Jurisprudence, equivalent to a law degree, but with far less compensation. Personnel committees, pastor search committees need to be educated about this reality. One of the things that we have been suggesting is it would be wise for churches to plan a means of assisting in discharging the debt of their new minister, kind of like a med school model. You know, I will serve at Mount Baptist Pisgah number 2 for 6 years and allow this debt to be discharged. It's high time that seminaries and churches find ways to collaborate in this, simply by educating churches about the realities. We're united, seminaries and churches, in our desire for ministers to have the freedom to serve with energy and with confidence. And we know that the stewardship for all of us requires a better interface between the cost of preparing for ministry and actually serving in ministry. Now, there are times when I wish our school was located in Indiana, only because the Lilly Endowment gives most of its money right there in its backyard in Indiana. They've actually figured out a program whereby they are assisting churches who have called new ministers and have taken on the educational debt as a part of compensation without being a tax burden for the new minister. It's a creative thing to do, and we can do it other places if we will simply figure out the metrics on this. Well, let me wrap this up. As we think about the changing landscape for congregations, it's paramount that we invest resources in sustainable forms of excellent ministry and sustainable forms of ministry preparation. If we do so, pastoral leadership will be more inviting, and congregations will be more equitable in their practices, and churches and ministers will be able to afford one another. Amen.
Thank you for that probing and thought-provoking presentation. she's raised some issues for all of us. So we've got about 10 minutes of time. If you have questions you'd like to ask Molly about the issues that she's raised, observations that she's made, would you be willing to do that? We have another microphone right over here and one back here. So if you have a question, raise your hand, please, and let's see if we can spend a few minutes with all of us thinking through the issues. I don't know about you, but to hear this is rather sobering, to say the least. So let's think about it. What issues does it raise for you? Questions?
One issue you didn't address is the likelihood of the parsonage allowance disappearing. It's already made its way through a court of appeals and is on its way to the Supreme Court. If that happens, it'll be a game changer as well. Exactly,
and thank you for bringing that up. That's a critical thing. Yes, it really is, and we and our congregations are just going to have to think very differently about compensation. Something that struck me, Dale, was the interesting parity in terms of median incomes, and I think about the churches across Kansas and Nebraska, Iowa, some of the churches we serve. Many would be below that, as you know, but the median holds, I think, about the same. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question about, do you qualify students before they're accepted for postgraduate work?
Do we qualify them financially?
From the standpoint of evaluating them, is this something appropriate for you to consider postgraduate work at this particular point in time in your life?
Yes.
If you have large debt,
Yes.
would that get in the way of doing that?
Technically, you're not supposed to ask that. That's one of those FERPA things, one of those laws. When we did our program, our project, it was voluntary, and we never linked a name with the amount of debt. Something we have done, however, we are embedding financial counseling as a part of the enrollment process, so that if one is going to accrue further debt, he or she thinks about vocation, thinks about stewardship, thinks about what this will mean for him or her, and gains some credible financial literacy in that process. Though the figures as to what educational debt one brings with one are very closely held. They're never published. There's one office that is aware of that, 2 officers who collaborate in that. But no, we don't make that a disqualifier. One of the things we've learned also is that minority communities tend to have larger educational debt, especially women. And there are a lot of structural and systemic reasons for that. In their communities, they have been encouraged to get education no matter what. Get education. And the other side of that, in terms of understanding what the implications are, is something we're trying to intervene in. But there is, at times, a sense, this horse has left the barn. I don't know if we're going to be able to help this person find a way to discharge this debt.
I don't know that I know of any pastors of churches that are sustainable and financially healthy who have gone bivocational and made that transition. I think the only times I've seen that happen is when a church is failing and it's an absolute necessity. There's no other option. But I think what I'm hearing you say and what I've seen from others is we need to start thinking about that. Maybe some pastors in churches that are financially stable need to say, can I move in this direction just to make more means for ministry available in my church? Have you seen that happen in healthy, financially sustainable churches? And what are some tips to help that happen?
I think your paradigm is usually the case. It is with the truncation of budget, and that often a church will go to bivocational pastor, a shared pastorate. My colleague Angie, she and her husband share, but it's still not, full in terms of how they have sorted that out in her church in Topeka. I think it would be really a good thing to think through when there's an interim period, perhaps in a congregation, think through what this might mean. And my perception of younger ministers is many want a more permeable boundary between the gathered community of the congregation and other nonprofit work they might be able to do within their context. And it's becoming a more attractive model rather than a default kind of reality. But I need to study more about those churches that have intentionally taken this on, not out of crisis, but out of a promise for expanded ministry. Thank you for that.
I understand that this economic summit, and thank you so much for those of you who were involved in making it happen. I understand that this is really part of finding some solutions. But these numbers are really staggering to look at. A third of senior pastors going to retire with no home or not prepared for home and income. I just wonder at what point do we take seriously the justice issues of asking pastors to put themselves in this kind of position. I understand that there are many willing to do it, but I just wonder what we will do from an ecclesiastical standpoint and from a polity standpoint to start to really address the structure that leads us to this, really a tragedy that I see here on paper.
Well, it is. In the Jewish tradition, there's a saying, who will bless the people, the rabbi will. Who will bless the rabbi, the people will. And I would like for congregations to think more about blessing their pastors and freeing them not to have this worry about retirement, educating their kids, and all the rest. I think it would make for much greater congregational and pastoral health if we would attend to that.
And I think the very fact that we are having this dialogue is one of the attempts to say, how can we address this critical issue? This has been simmering under the surface for some time. It's now out in plain view, and we've got to work at it. NTS, through the grant that we've received, both seminaries have received the grant, has a financial literacy materials available for every student. They go through that. They are able to take, I think, 14 sessions on financial literacy. And if they don't do that, then they have to meet with a counselor to address the issues. I think 1/3 of NTS grads graduate with no educational debt, about 1/3 with a relatively manageable debt, but there's 1/3 who graduate with debt that is likely to limit their capacity as a pastor. And so it's a concern that we all have. We've got to find ways to address this. Other questions? Yes. Microphone right here.
I'm thinking on the educational side of the equation. The question is very intimidating. Could be very disheartening. Can the church and seminary? Can the minister or church afford each other? How can they not? And I wonder if the church could afford an uneducated clergy.
Yeah.
And so I guess for me, it's on the educational side, we're talking about a situation that is a consolidated, intensive theological educational program. What if it was just in time or
On the job?
drawn out? I'm thinking of $100,000. I mean, that used to be a mortgage, right? 30 years. What if it was an education occurred over the course of an entire career? I mean, I think we've always kind of stayed within this 3-year mindset, right? I think there's been some conceptualizing of education beyond that. model. Could new models have a place or be received in order to not lose an educated clergy?
I appreciate the question very much. I thought about entitling this "Counting the Cost of an Educated Clergy." And my bias, of course, is that an educated clergy brings a particular constellation of preparation and competency and gifts and understanding because of the formation that occurs with professors and other colleagues. But the statistics show that the Master of Divinity, which has been the gold standard of theological education, is in decline. MAs are growing. Why? They're shorter. They cost less, they're shorter. And so specialized MA degrees become more the norm in many theological schools, MA in youth ministry, MA in missional church studies. And they actually excise what are some significant aspects of the body of divinity. But are there ways, perhaps, a better interface between congregation and seminary in terms of the contextualized learning? Surely there is. And there are ways that churches can add that, helping defray costs, becoming the place where one practices the gifts and graces of ministry. There are those folk who are arguing that the just-in-time learning is the best educational model. Well, I do believe that there are certain things that cannot be learned in the classroom that can only be learned in the congregational context. But how we put those together and keep our accreditation, which continues to matter because it is a standard, it helps us think about excellence, it helps us facilitate should our students need to transfer to other schools. And so I find it important in that respect. But new models of ministry, new credentialing, this is one of the critical conversations right now. Do you have to have an MDiv to be ordained? Well, there are non-canonical ways to use that language. Most regions, judicatories are beginning to say that doesn't have to be. Commissioned lay pastors or ordained by doing certificate studies, etc. I want to have a whole lot of on-ramps into theological education, preparation for ministry. There is a place for the seminary. There's a place for the theological school. It may not be possible for others because of their location, their prior debt, their level of educational preparation. They have shifted in midlife, sensing a call from God. And so, yes, I'm for other models, and they are discussed all the while. There's a movement to reimagine theological education, and it's happening at all levels.
Thinking about bivocational ministry and if that model would become more broadly practiced, at what cost does that come to the classical understandings of the pastoral office? So thinking about serving the sacraments, preaching, praying, visitation, if bivocational ministry becomes not only a reality but an advocated model, at what cost does it come to our classical understanding of the pastoral office?
Well, I don't think I'd call a bivocational person who couldn't work it out to be there on Sunday. And so there you have part of the answer to that. That would be a rather important thing, to be there on the Lord's Day. I think congregations will have to understand themselves in different ways. And part of the challenge of that is many congregations often think that they hire their pastor to do their ministry for them. And so there is the call of the diaconate, there is the call of the Stevens ministers, there is the call of these others to do pastoral care, to do education, to do planning, to help even in the planning of worship. I'm an inveterate optimist. I think could be for the empowering of the whole people of God. But I think it would take some re-education as people get over being spectators and passive and much more participatory. And so I think the lag time in re-educating a congregation might be a part of the cost of it. But I think I can see more advantage than disadvantage in terms of the long-term impact. Thank you for that thinking. I didn't know that Nazarenes used sacramental language. I'm just impressed. You know, Baptists talk about ordinances because we think Jesus ordered us to do them. So there you have it. Thank you all so
Let's say
much.
thank you to Dr. Marley Marshall.